First of all, I'd like to do some apologies because I imagine a number of you signed up for this training expecting Matt Jenkin to be presenting it with Sophie. He has unfortunately had to go to an injunction hearing at the last minute this week, so I'm stepping in. If you haven't met me before, my name's Alex Harper. I'm a senior solicitor in the employment team, and I've actually just come back last week from maternity leave. Today, we're being joined by Sophie Prothero from our corporate team. She's going to take us through share schemes in particular as we focus this session on employee incentivisation. I'm just going to give everyone a few moments to join, and then because there's quite a lot of content to get through, we're going to crack on unless anyone has any objections. So just a couple of housekeeping points while we're waiting. I've been told there isn't going to be an emergency lighting test in our office in the next half an hour. So if everything goes dark, it will only be temporary, and the presentation and our Wi-Fi will be going. It's just that Sophie and I will be sat in the dark temporarily. Don't be alarmed, that is planned. And then in terms of questions, both Sophie and I are very much happy for this session to be interactive. So if you have a question as it goes through and you want to pop that in the chat, then please do. Unfortunately, I can't see the Q&A functionality on Teams while I'm presenting the slides. So if you could keep questions in the chat, that will assist in us in making sure that the questions are answered. And there was the, I'm assuming, lighting test that I mentioned. Otherwise, yeah, there is time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So if you have a burning question, then either please raise your hand and let us know, or alternatively put it in the chat, or we'll take questions at the end. So just briefly to go through kind of what we're covering today, I'm going to start us off by setting the scene. I think we all know why we're here, really. And that's, of course, because employment has gone beyond just offering a good salary, and there's very much a war on talent. So we're going to look at that briefly. Sophie will then take the reins and take us through shares and share schemes and how they can be used to incentivize employees. And then I'll finish up the session just having a brief look at the challenges of a multi-generational workforce, looking at flexibility and flexible working, DE&I and culture, and then other tools of the trade to incentivize and recognize employees. So just briefly starting on the war on talent, as you can see from the slide, recruitment is getting ever more competitive. 69% competition for well-qualified talent is the increase. And 64% of employers have experienced difficulties attracting candidates. So it's really, I think, what we're seeing is an exceptionally competitive job market. Equally, there are challenges with retention. So 56% of respondents as part of a CIPD survey confirmed they were having an increase in retention challenges. 41% of employees of those respondents had resigned in the first 12 months. And 27% of employers, which I think is actually quite an incredibly high number, had candidates fail to turn up on the first day after they'd been offered a job. So we've really entered a world where competition for the best employees is rife. And as I said earlier, we've moved beyond just offering a good salary in terms of how to attract employees. And so what I'm going to do now is pass you over to Sophie, who's going to take you through one of the ways, aside from a good salary, a competitive salary, that you as employers might be able to attract top talent.
Thanks, Alex. So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. As Alex has said, I'm a solicitor in the corporate team specialising in share schemes. So as a brief overview, I'm just going to be covering a few key points today. So firstly, the benefits associated with introducing a staff incentive scheme, and then also what different types of incentive scheme could look like. So for example, EMIs and growth shares. So firstly, what are incentive schemes and why would a company want to implement an incentive scheme? So incentive schemes are a way for employers to give their employees the option to hold shares in their company. So when an employee has been granted an option, they will have a right to acquire shares in the company in the future. Each employee who has been granted an option will be an option holder, and when the option holder has exercised their option, they will become a shareholder, and they will then have the same rights as all other shareholders who hold the same class of shares that they do. So as you can see, an option scheme is a great way to motivate and retain staff. Employees will be aware that if the company performs well, they will see the benefits too. For example, when the founders sell the business, they'll be able to realise the value of the shares that they hold. So as a result of this, the business therefore enjoys the rewards of engaged employees who are driven by the business growing and achieving more. And that is essentially one of the reasons why an incentive scheme can be a great route for your business. Share schemes also allow employers to reward staff for their hard work. So as you may know, shares usually come with rights relating to voting, dividends and capital. So through implementing a share scheme, employers are effectively giving their employees those rights in relation to the company, which, as I've said, gives employees a greater level of involvement in the running of the business. So if we just go on to, yeah, there we go. So what are the different types of incentive schemes? So there are a number of different types of incentive schemes that a company might choose to implement. Different share schemes are subject to different tax treatment, with some share schemes being approved by HMRC and therefore tax advantaged, and some being unapproved by HMRC and therefore unfortunately not subject to the tax advantages. So today's presentation is going to focus on EMIs and growth share schemes, which are just, a few of the share schemes that a company may choose to put in place. Employment-related securities. So firstly, just a quick review of employment-related securities. So as you may know, any shares issued or transferred to an employee have the potential to be treated as income and therefore taxed at income tax rates. However, it is important to consider the rules that apply to employment-related securities and the implications of tax advantage incentive schemes compared to non-tax advantaged incentive schemes. So essentially, a security will be employment-related if a person acquires that security by reason of their employment. So employment-related securities therefore commonly arise where securities in an employing entity are acquired or held by employees or directors. So as I've said, employment-related securities can either be non-tax advantaged, for example, a straight issue of shares in the company. These are referred to as income vehicles, as income tax is charged at 20, 40 or 45% based on taxable income under the current tax rules. So although a non-tax advantage scheme may be viewed as less restrictive on the company, for example, depending on the circumstances, there may be fewer statutory requirements for the company to comply with. Allowing an employee to acquire shares through a tax advantage scheme is often more preferable due to the lower tax rates. So looking at tax advantage schemes, for example, EMIs, these are referred to as capital vehicles, as from the 30th of October 2024, capital gains tax is charged at 18% or 24% based on taxable income. So under a tax advantage scheme, employees will not pay income tax or national insurance contributions on the grant of an EMI option. And this will also be the case on the exercise of an EMI option, provided that the exercise price is at least equal to the market value of the shares at the date of grant. However, as you may expect, there are rules that must be complied with to allow the tax advantage status to apply. For example, qualifying conditions applicable to EMI options. So that's just an overview of the tax treatment. So just looking at EMIs more generally. So what is an EMI? So an EMI is a share option scheme and therefore provides selected employees with the option to acquire shares in the company that they work for at a set price and at a set time in the future. So an EMI scheme is made up of an EMI option agreement and EMI plan rules. So if you look at each component in turn, so firstly, the option agreement. So each employee who is part of the scheme will receive an agreement with the specific terms that apply to their option. So this allows the scheme to apply to different employees in different ways, and the specific terms of the agreement can therefore consider factors such as job role, seniority, and the value that different employees bring to the business. Different conditions can apply to each employee who is part of the scheme, and these conditions will determine when each employee can exercise their option. In addition to this, employers can also provide different employees with the option to acquire different numbers of shares in the company, which again allows the creation of a bespoke plan for each employee. The option agreement will also be accompanied by the plan rules. So whilst each employee's option agreement will be specific to their circumstances, the plan rules apply to each option holder in the same way. So different types of EMIs. So an EMI can be exercisable on an exit or on the satisfaction of performance conditions or on the lapse of time. So firstly, exit only. So under this type of EMI, options would become exercisable only on the occurrence of an exit. So this would typically be a share sale, an asset sale, or a listing. The employees would acquire their shares immediately before the exit, and the buyer would acquire the employee's shares as part of the exit. Just an important thing to note in terms of actually buying the shares. So the EMI can provide for a cashless exercise mechanism. So this means that the employees don't need to fund the acquisition of their option shares directly, and the sum would instead be deducted from the price they would receive from the sale proceeds when the buyer buys their shares. So that just cuts out sort of having the cash needed to buy the shares in the first place. So as an alternative to exit only, the trigger can be exercise conditions or the lapse of time. So conditions can apply to different employees in different ways and can relate to matters such as reaching performance targets. So for example, in relation to customer satisfaction, customer retention, or even achieving technical KPIs. So upon satisfaction of these targets, the option will become exercisable over a certain number of option shares. Alternatively, it's also possible for options to become exercisable after a lapse of time, for example, 3 years from being granted the option. So we're just going to take a quick look at the criteria needed to implement an EMI, and criteria apply to the company and the employees. So a company can only implement an EMI scheme if certain qualifying conditions are satisfied. So firstly, the company must be independent of other companies. So this means that the company must not be a 51% subsidiary of or otherwise under the control of another company or any person connected with it. So therefore, in a group structure, EMI options should be granted over shares in the top co. Secondly, the company must have only qualifying subsidiaries. So this essentially means that the company must own at least 51% of the shares in any of its subsidiaries. Number 3, at the time the EMI options are granted, the gross assets of the company must not exceed £30 million. In addition to this, the company must have less than 250 full-time employees at the time of the grant of the EMI options. The company must be trading or the parent company of a trading group. And finally, the company must have a permanent UK establishment. There are also conditions that apply for the employees. So EMI options can only be granted to genuine employees of the company. So any employee can only be part of the EMI scheme if they meet the following criteria. So firstly, the employee must work for the company for at least 25 hours a week, or if less, 75% of their working time. They must not have a material interest in the company, and they must not be a non-executive director of the company or a consultant. So these 3 qualifying conditions must be met at the time the option is granted.
Sophie, do you mind if I just ask a question there? What would be classified as a material interest out of interest?
So this would generally be regarded as a 30% shareholding in the company. So essentially the essence of EMIs would typically be to provide benefits to just general employees rather than, shareholders, that kind of thing. So we want to sort of restrict the power sitting with one class of individual, essentially.
No, that makes perfect sense. Sorry for the interruption. I'll let you carry on.
No problem. So just some further information on tax treatment for the company. So the company will benefit in the form of a corporation tax deduction. So HMRC provides that where an employee obtains a share option plan or is awarded shares, corporation tax legislation generally allows the employee and company a corporation tax deduction at the point when the employee acquires the shares. So for you, this means that a corporation tax deduction will be available to the company at the time the EMI options are exercised by the relevant employee. Also tax treatment for the employees. So EMI share schemes are tax advantaged, as I've mentioned, and therefore approved by HMRC. So this means that tax treatment is favourable for employees who are granted options. So if the option remains a qualifying option, there will be no income tax liability for the employee when they are granted the option. At the time the employee exercises their option, there will be no income tax liability if the exercise price was at least equal to the market value of the shares at the time the options were granted. And when an employee sells the option shares, CGT may be payable on any gain over the market value of the shares at the grant date. So sorry if we just go back one slide. Sorry, Alex. There we go. This can be compared to the tax treatment of a non-tax advantage share scheme. So if a share option scheme is non-tax advantage, the tax treatment for the employee would be as follows. So no tax arises when the employee is granted the options. That's the same as an EMI. However, when the option is exercised, income tax will be due on the difference between the exercise price and the market value of the share. And then also on disposal, CGT will be payable on the difference in the disposal proceeds and the market value of the shares when the option was exercised. If we just go on to the next slide, sorry. There are also non-tax advantages associated with EMIs. So as you'll be aware, and as I touched on briefly, shares are accompanied by rights relating to voting, dividends and distributions. So by introducing an EMI scheme, subject to any limits on rights that you may impose, for example, non-voting shares, the company is effectively giving the employees the opportunity to acquire these rights in relation to the company and therefore benefit from the company's success. So three key factors. Firstly, recruitment. So EMI schemes are widely used across many industries and are often expected by skilled candidates when considering a new job. So therefore, including an EMI scheme within the company's overall recruitment offering can really help the company stand out when hiring and increases the value of the salary package. An EMI scheme can also help create the impression that the company values its employees and is committed to rewarding long-term contribution. This also links to retention. So an EMI scheme plays a key role in encouraging employees to stay with the company and contribute to its growth and success. So, for example, the individuals will be able to realise the value of the shares on an exit. In addition to this, an EMI scheme can help create an ownership mentality amongst employees and incentivises them to participate in long-term business strategies, essentially. Reward, another key benefit of EMIs. So an EMI scheme is a tax-efficient way of recognising long service and therefore ensures that the journey of business ownership recognises all that were involved, which are often the employees. So just going on to disqualifying events. So if a disqualifying event occurs, the favourable tax treatment of EMI options is lost. So disqualifying events include, firstly, the company whose shares are under option becoming a subsidiary of or otherwise under the control of another company. Secondly, the company ceasing to meet the trading activities requirement. Also, the option holder ceasing to be an eligible employee, the employee ceasing to meet the working time requirements, the employee ceasing employment with the EMI company or any subsidiary of it, any alterations to the share capital of the company whose shares are under option that affect the value of the shares under option, and finally, a conversion of shares under option into shares of a different class unless an exception can be relied upon. So EMI limits. So although EMIs can be very advantageous for both the company and the employees, there are limits on the shares held under EMI options. So the limits apply to both the company and the individuals. So the total value of shares under EMI options granted by the company cannot exceed £3 million at any time. So if an option is granted that causes this limit to be exceeded, the option is not a qualifying EMI option as to the excess. There is also a £250,000 limit for individuals. So once an employee has been granted EMI options up to this limit, no further qualifying EMI options can be granted until 3 years after the last of those EMI options were granted, even if some have been exercised or released. I'm also just going to touch on how private equity investors interact with EMIs. So private equity investors rely heavily on the management team to drive growth and increase company value. So for this reason, a company with an established EMI scheme is often attractive for private equity investors, as key individuals will be motivated to achieve growth for the company due to being able to realise the value of their shares on an exit. Option holders are incentivised to increase value for the company, meaning they're inclined to work more productively and strategically. The possibility of holding shares in the company and realising the value of those shares on an exit also means that key team members are less likely to leave before an exit. This provides stability for private equity investors and reduces the risk of their investment. It's also important to note that a private equity investment may trigger exercise of exit-only options if the investment reaches the requirements of an exit, but it is possible to avoid this by carving out a private equity investment from the exit trigger. So just going on to growth shares. So firstly, what are growth shares? So growth shares are a class of shares that only participate in value above a certain growth hurdle. So these shares typically have no rights until the hurdle is achieved. The hurdle is usually related to the company's value exceeding a certain threshold, and growth shares are typically seen as performance-only shares. So essentially, if the company grows in value, they are valuable. So just looking at an example of how growth shares operate. So if the company is currently valued at £1 million, the growth hurdle may be a 25% increase in value. The employees would be entitled to share in the capital of the company after the company reaches a 1.25 million valuation, as it's a 25% increase from the current value. So just taking this one step further, just looking at one question we've had, can investors dilute the value of shares? Yes, so if an investor came in, if they were issued the same class, this would cause a dilution, but it is possible to have different classes for different groups. So for example, you could have the founders having ordinary shares, EMIs being over A shares, and then investors over B shares. So you can keep everyone sort of in their separate camps in that way. So if we just go back to growth shares, so I think I got to no problem, Cheryl. So just looking at if the company grows in value and is sold for £2 million, the employees would be entitled to share in the value over which the £1.25 million hurdle has been achieved. So they'd be able to share in the £750,000 excess. So if we just look at benefits of growth shares, so firstly, minimal funding is required from employees. So the principal reason for introducing growth shares for employees is to enable them to invest in the company without having to pay for a proportion of its current value. The employees will need to pay the market value to acquire growth shares. However, the market value of a growth share at the time of acquisition will be much lower than that of an ordinary share, and this makes it easier for employees to afford to invest. Secondly, retention and incentivising growth. So allotting growth shares is a method of retaining employees and incentivising company growth. The holders of growth shares only receive value for their shares if the company's value increases above a certain hurdle. So growth shares therefore encourage employees to achieve growth for the company. Thirdly, this links to Cheryl's question. So existing shareholders are not diluted by an issue of growth shares. So from the point of view from existing shareholders, their share ownership of the current value of the company will not be diluted by an issue of growth shares. Whereas it would be diluted by an issue of ordinary shares. So this links to the point of having different share classes for different groups. So how are growth shares implemented? So growth shares require the introduction of a new share class. So this would involve an amendment to the articles and the shareholders' agreement, if there is one. The company will need to decide the threshold above which value will be shared with growth shareholders. And this is typically a percentage above the company's current value, and growth shares do not benefit from any value below that threshold. So tax treatment. So tax advice should be taken on the tax treatment of growth shares. However, just giving you a general overview. So when growth shares are acquired, they are treated as income. However, if there's no value to the growth shares on acquisition, there'll be no value to pay income tax on. Growth shares are also generally subject to CGT rather than income tax on disposal, which is favourable for employees due to the lower tax rate. So how can growth shares interact with EMIs? So it's interesting to see how the two incentive arrangements can overlap to provide an optimal benefit for staff. So as I discussed, an EMI scheme is a HMRC approved share option plan designed to help small and medium-sized companies attract and retain key employees by granting them tax advantage share options. So when structured over growth shares, the EMI can offer even more targeted rewards for value creation. So just a brief recap of how an EMI works. So employees are granted options to buy shares in the company at a fixed exercise price. There are significant tax advantages if the scheme's statutory requirements are met, And the requirements include, for example, the company having gross assets under £30 million and less than 250 full-time employees. As we've just discussed, growth shares are a special class of shares that only participate in value above a certain hurdle, typically growth beyond the company's current valuation. And growth shares are designed to reward employees for future growth rather than past value. So if you wanted to put in place an EMI for growth shares, the steps would typically be as follows. So firstly, the new growth share class would need to be created. So these could be called, for example, G shares. And those shares would only have the right to participate in value created above a set threshold, for example, £5 million. The EMI scheme would then need to be adopted. So this would involve completion of an eligibility assessment in relation to whether the company meets the statutory requirements to implement an EMI. So we can do this for you. Your accountant would then need to prepare a valuation and agree this with HMRC. And the option agreement and plan rules would then need to be drafted. Again, something we can do for you. So the employees who receive options under the EMI scheme would have the right to acquire the growth shares in the future at the agreed price. The employees would then acquire the growth shares either on exit when a certain time period has passed or when performance conditions have been met. So an EMI for growth shares can be beneficial for the company for many reasons. For example, a growth hurdle motivates employees to drive long-term value, and an EMI scheme itself can be flexible as to its operation to create a bespoke arrangement for each employee. As we've discussed, there are also benefits for employees. So the main benefit being the tax treatment compared to other incentive arrangements. Also, employees often feel more involved in the business if they know they will directly benefit from its growth and success. So how could this all work in practice? So let's say the company is currently valued at £4 million. Growth shares are structured with a £5 million hurdle. An employee receives EMI options over growth shares, which are exercisable on an exit. So 3 years down the line, the company is sold for £10 million. As an exit has occurred, the options become exercisable. As the £5 million hurdle has been reached, the growth shares now have value. So if we take the 10 million sale price, less the £5 million growth hurdle, there is £5 million available to growth shareholders. So as you can see, before the employees can see a benefit for their share options, the exercise trigger has to have occurred. So in this case, the trigger is the sale of a company, an exit. And if the option is over growth shares, the growth hurdle has to have been reached. So that is just a two-pronged approach to really create an optimal benefit for staff. So in summary, incentive schemes are a great way to recruit, retain and reward key employees. Offering incentive schemes can really make your company stand out when looking to hire top talent. Incentive schemes also really help to create an ownership mentality amongst key employees and can also provide a favourable tax position for employees if certain conditions are met. So unless anyone has any further questions, I will hand you back to Alex.
I can't see any questions in the chat, Sophie, but thank you for taking us through that. I think it's important to take note of EMIs because, as Sophie's mentioned, in some industries they are becoming really standard and almost the expectation. But also, given the war on talent that I mentioned at the start, they are a really good way to differentiate your business from others. And I'll touch on this as I come onto my slides shortly, but it can an ownership mentality can really foster a positive culture within a business, and that can also help with kind of wider employee retention in terms of how they feel valued by the business, and also that they recognize the value of the business growing, so they are directly rewarded for their hard work. So I think it's a really an area for employers that's certainly got to be of interest given the difficulties everyone is having with recruitment and retention. I'm sort of now going to take us through the sort of way we manage this new multi-generational workforce that we're all finding ourselves working in. At the moment, there are 5 generations in one workforce, and as I'm sure all appreciate, that comes with a very unique set of challenges. The first of which is an aging workforce, really. For the first time, the the proportion of over 50s in the workforce is rising. So it's anticipated that 37% of the workforce will be over 50 by 2040. And the employment rate gap, so the difference between age groups within being represented within business is decreasing rather than increasing, which is causing a number of problems in terms of career planning, because how do you have a pathway for people to progress if your top talent at the top who've been there for years and would have previously retired now aren't retiring? So yeah, just to stress that, as I have on the slide, there's a large number of employees who are now over 50. It's a third of all workers. And so what are the reasons for that? Obviously, fertility is declining, and the reasons for that can be explored at length, but largely, due to kind of childcare costs and generally economic pressures. That also works at the other end of the scale. So that's the economic pressures are encouraging people to work longer or requiring people to work longer. And of course, life expectancy is going up, which is great, but it just means that workforces have to adapt to accommodate that. One of the ways you can look at that is through pension schemes. Obviously, you guys will all be aware of the auto enrollment rules and the minimum employee and employee contributions that are now in force. But a good way to differentiate yourself from different employers is to offer enhanced pension packages. So go beyond the 5% and the 3% minimum contributions and look at how you can invest in your employees' retirement. It's something that is quite hotly contested by employees because everyone has an eye, particularly in the younger generations, to how old they're going to have to be when they can retire. Daryl, I can see you've asked a question. What we'll do is we'll ask that one. We'll get Sophie to cover that one at the end, just because we're now in the sort of section on pensions rather than on shareholding, just so you know your question's been picked up. So going back to pensions, obviously you can look at enhancing your packages, and also have a think about how you're covering gaps in employment. So when you have a pension scheme, you might have a standard, employee scheme where whatever they pay in, up to 10%, you as an employer will match. Now that's a fairly standard enhanced scheme. But think about what you do, for example, if your employee goes off on maternity leave. Are you going to continue the pension contributions for that period? That's a really good way to differentiate yourself from other employers, and also strengthen your family-friendly credentials if you are going to continue those payments, even though obviously during maternity leave an employee's pay might fluctuate. Think about as well bonus payments. Now, I'm not going to suggest that everyone makes bonus payments pensionable, but what you could look at doing is offering employees the opportunity to put part of their bonus directly into their pension scheme if your pension scheme rules allow. Another thing to consider about pensions in general is whether or not what your pension scheme is. I would say, in my experience now, about 90% of pension schemes are defined contribution schemes rather than defined benefit. But if you are looking at introducing a defined benefit scheme, and what that means is rather than having a defined amount that you put in, you get a defined value at the end. So defined benefit pension were the gold standard of pensions back in the day. Often they were final salary. Essentially, what it meant is you were guaranteed your final salary as part of your pension package. Those no longer exist. They were phased out gradually through a lot of regulation and a lot of investigations by the FCA in terms of moving towards defined contribution schemes, which is where you define what you put in. And that's broadly what we have now, where employers put in a proportion and employees put in their own money as well. The other area that you can think about looking at is phased retirement, and this really ties into thinking about adjusting your employment practices, really, in terms of, do you have older employees who are maybe looking to retire? And obviously you can't ask the question without that being discriminatory on the basis of age. But if you are aware that employees are thinking about that sort of thing, could you sort of preempt that question by having a policy which says, if you're interested, you can start phasing down your hours, and then you can look at how you progress younger people, or more junior, let's say, rather than talking about things in terms of old and young. You can then progress your more junior staff up into the more senior roles as your senior employees go into a kind of phased exit on a flexible basis. The other thing I would always say when we're talking about retirement is obviously steer clear of a retirement age being mandatory. There are exceptional circumstances where you can justify having a retirement age, but generally they are very risky in terms of age discrimination. So I would steer clear unless you've got incredibly strong business reasons for justifying having a mandatory retirement age. Then looking at kind of that idea of having flexibility, we've also got to consider ill health more and more. I think all of us since COVID have seen an increase in employees going off sick, and that doesn't seem to be abating now, despite COVID being many years ago. That's also, of course, been supplemented by the changes to SSP, which is now payable from day one. So immediately we've got an increased cost associated with ill health absences. And really what we need to be looking at there is how we're training our managers to manage ill health support, always having that flag in their mind about reasonable adjustments for potential disability, and making use of occupational health and EAP services, which you might have in place, and which again are another way to incentivize employees to join you over a competitor. If you've got strong EAP programs, a lot of them now come with therapy, GP access. You can really go quite extensively into that. You can also look at kind of schemes for health insurance, which can also which vary. So you can either have sort of just a general private health insurance cover, like with a provider like Bupa, where you can get private medical access, so you don't have to rely on the NHS. You can also look at more extensive schemes like permanent health insurance or group income protection. These are policies that I would sort of use with caution, because once you award that reward to an employee, it can create an expectation and it can be very difficult to manage or take it away. Essentially, permanent health insurance or group income protection are policies where if someone goes off sick, the insurer will, after a certain time, and provided they meet a certain criteria, continue to pay a proportion of their salary to them until a set age, or depending on the rules of the scheme, possibly for a number of years. But it can create complication. For example, if you've got an employee who's on a permanent health insurance scheme, so it's currently an employee of yours, but not someone you're paying because the insurer has taken over payment, and then you're looking at redundancies in your business. As an example, it can create complications. So those offerings are available and something definitely to be considered when you're looking at the cost of ill health to your business, but just with a word of caution from me on offering them in the first instance. Obviously, I've mentioned no fault retirement age. It's again something that can be justified but is incredibly difficult, so I would steer clear. And likewise with ill health, just always have an eye to potentially disability discrimination based claims, because those can be costly. Looking at flexibility then is another key proponent of a package that you can offer to retain and recruit employees. You can see from the stats on the slide, it's very much seemingly what employees want. But as you'll probably no doubt have seen in the news, it's very much something that employers are starting to move away from. So we've got this situation where only 1 in 10 Gen Z employees want to work full time in the office. And things like work-life balance are becoming the leading kind of differentiators and motivators for employees to choose where they're working. That does create a sort of tension between employers and employees. So where employers are now wanting people to come back, but employees are wanting to stay working from home, and there's a conflict there that's inherent. Obviously, if you're looking to mandate a return, you'll need to carefully assess the legal risk of how you've done that. And it's largely going to depend on how you've enforced hybrid working or working from home. So a lot of people during COVID just created policies that weren't contractual, which said, actually, we're going to convert to a hybrid process. A policy is a very easy thing to amend. Indeed, most of you will have handbooks that say you have the absolute right to amend them at any time. And all handbooks broadly should, and if they don't, come and see me at the end, say they're non-contractual. So if you've got a policy, you're probably on safe grounds to start moving people back into the office, but you're going to need to weigh up the risk of losing employees or just generally creating a workforce that's unhappy and therefore more prone to raising grievances or complaints. The other side of the coin then is where you've potentially got a breach of contract claim, and that can arise in two ways. Firstly, where you've got an employee who has something in the contract that says they have a right to flexible working. It might be that it says in their contract that their place of work is split between their home and the office, for example. That's going to be a breach of contract then if you try to force that employee to come back to the office full time, and you're going to need to look at how you can consult with them to change the contractual terms. Then obviously, assuming they don't agree as part of the consultation, you can look at the sort of fire and rehire on an individual or even a group level. But you've got to be mindful of the risk of constructive unfair dismissal claims associated with that. And of course, the reputational risk of that, given that fire and rehire processes are generally seen by the public as unacceptable practices. In terms of the other way that a breach of contract claim may arise when you're looking at mandating a return to the office, that largely comes into play when you've got an argument that an employee has a contractual term by custom and practice. Now, what that means is, for example, if everyone in your workforce has been working from home since COVID and you've not asked them to return back, they could argue that their right to work from home for a certain amount of time has become a contractual term by custom and practice, in which case you're back to the possibility of having to do a consultation exercise to change a contractual term. A lot of employers choose, rather than to do a consultation process right off the bat, to try and change contract by consent in the first instance and then consult with people who won't consent to the change. So there are options there around consultation, but we just need to be mindful of a potential contractual term arising, even if it's not written down in the contract, and how we process that. Just thinking ahead, obviously, a lot of you will have seen the Employment Rights Bill and all of the changes that are coming in with that. Just be mindful that fire and rehire is absolutely front and centre in those changes. So anyone who's looking at mandating an office return, I would recommend you do that sooner rather than later, before the Employment Rights Bill comes into force. As well, if anyone wants an update on the Employment Rights Bill, that's going to be our August webinar. So moving on sort of from flexibility, another key differentiator for particularly in the younger generations in our workforce is DE&I. As you can see from the slide, 59% of employees would now consider quitting or would just quit if an employer rolled back on its DE&I policies. As you probably expect, the most likely to quit generation are Gen Z on the basis of DE&I. And those numbers are, again, as you'd expect, even higher from those with BAME backgrounds. Now, you can't really talk about DE&I at the moment without looking at the Trump effect. So obviously, President Trump, via a number of executive orders, has rowed back extensively on DE&I in the US, and has essentially told employers that if they don't roll back their DE&I initiatives, he won't fund government contracts with them. That has resulted in some quite big names like Disney and Boeing rolling back their DE&I initiatives altogether. But we've got to look at that in comparison to the UK, because while we might have multinational conglomerates who are rolling back DE&I in the US, in the UK, that's a little bit trickier to achieve. So, and that's largely because in the UK, we have a very embedded kind of DE&I practice through our equality legislation. So the Equality Act 2010 prevents discrimination. Critically, though, what makes us different to the US is it is incredibly difficult to do anything that might be positive discrimination in the UK, similar to what the Americans have with affirmative action. That wouldn't be legal in the UK, and so it's a slightly different landscape. What that means is, rather than rowing back, a way to differentiate in the UK is to embed your DE&I policy and really promote it within your workforce. So regularly implement policy changes, review it, look at what you're doing and whether it's still fit for purpose. Conduct regular training on DE&I, really champion the policies that you have. Look at employee buy-in into the process. So if employees understand that this is coming from, as you can see on the slide, coming from the top, that DE&I is what you guys are about and it's what you're promoting, it really fosters a positive culture and really motivates people to stay. It's sort of basic really, but if someone thinks that where they work is a nice place to work, they are more likely to stay. There's just some points there about monitoring your figures. I mean, that might be looking at if you've got diversity targets, which are again quite a contested area, so might not be necessarily something you want to look at. But if you are then monitoring them and regularly reporting, that does feed into pay gap reporting, which is another thing that's set to change potentially with the Employment Rights Bill and the Race and Equality amendments that we're expecting to the Equality Act under the Labour government. So just bear in mind that if you're an employer over 250 employees at the moment, you'll be required to report on gender pay gaps. That is looking to be extended to cover race and disability as well when the new Equality Act amendments come into force. In terms of DE&I and then leading into culture, as I said, it really does matter what the culture of your business is. If people like working for you, they're more likely to stay, and they're more likely to tell people that you're a good employer and it's a nice place to work, so why wouldn't you join? But it does just go beyond being a nice place to work, and there are different ways that you can sort of think about that. One of the things that we've noticed in particular with the younger generations in our workforce is that there's a lot more kind of focus on recognition and support rather than just limiting it to sort of, well, you're getting paid a good salary, you get a good bonus, or you have, EMI options. It's actually as simple as having a good manager who recognizes your successes and supports you perhaps on things where you've not succeeded quite as well as you would like to. And it really does matter how your managers are treating the people they manage, because increasingly younger generations are motivated by positive feedback rather than, or in addition to all of the financial motivators that have traditionally been kind of valued more strongly by the older generations. And having a culture where you are mindful of DE&I and you are supportive, it actually encourages an environment of pay equality and discourages unconscious bias, both of which in turn help reduce employment tribunal claims, grievances, disciplinaries, and general grumbles. So I can't stress enough that while America might be rowing back on DE&I think it's going to be a difficult environment to do that in the UK with our equality legislation. But also there's a moral imperative to, and a commercial one, to keep moving forward with DE&I and building a positive culture within your workforce. So finally, and just briefly to look at sort of some of the other tools of the trade, which I've mentioned before, obviously you may have a bonus scheme in place with your as part of your remuneration packages. They can be very strong motivators for performance and strong motivation for retention. Likewise, commission programs are very similar. I would just say if you're implementing those, think about possible clawback clauses in your contracts, and also again looking at whether or not something in a bonus scheme could become contractual rather than just a policy. So my recommendation would be any kind of incentive scheme like a bonus or a commission-based scheme, for example, should be a policy, should state expressly it's not contractual, and should be regularly reviewed and amended. Another factor that you might look at is having kind of clear career development opportunities for employees. It's a challenge with having 5 generations of people in one workforce, is constantly keeping your talent flow moving up in the business. So trying to plan for that and looking at how you can make sure that there is space for people to progress is going to be critical in terms of retaining particularly your junior staff. Perks and benefits are another kind of standard. A lot of employers now have cycle to work schemes, or, offerings where they have apps where you can get discounts. Looking at those and making sure you're competitive is obviously key to employee retention. And just think about what your competitors are doing and whether or not you're market leading, because the more you are, the better and more attractive you will seem to potential employees. Another growth area we're seeing a lot with clients at the moment is offerings on family-friendly policies. I'm sure many of you have seen the Dad Shifts campaign to amend paternity legislation in the UK. It's an area where it's getting increasing coverage, and frankly can be an easy commercial win for a lot of employers. So if I'm talking to new clients about, or existing clients about their family-friendly policies, my first question is, first of all, what are they? But second of all, do they match? Because actually matching paternity policy to your maternity offering is often an easy way to really champion your family-friendly credentials without it costing too much money. Because sadly, even when enhanced paternity is offered, uptake on it is very low for the first few years, at least. You often find that employers will only have one dad actually take a full offering of enhanced paternity leave. But that dad does become 2 when he starts to tell his friends at your workplace that how great it was, and that becomes 3 and that becomes 4. And that long term can foster a really positive working environment where people feel valued. And then finally, work-life balance offerings. So aside from flexible working and working from home, which we've talked about at length, there are also elements that you can look at in terms of flexi time, for example. So a lot of employers now operate a flexi time offering over a 2-week period, so that employees can take Friday afternoons off, for example. And that might be something that works for your business. It might not be, but there are offerings like that you could think about in terms of remaining competitive and retaining and recruiting and retaining the best employees. In terms of other kind of work-life balance offerings, another option that you might want to look at is something like a sabbatical offering after a certain length of service. That can be a really good way to retain your kind of top talent, particularly as they become more senior in the business. So I think that was everything from us. So Sophie, we've obviously got the question from Daryl in the chat. And then if anyone else has any questions, we'd be happy to take those from you.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, just going to your question, Daryl. So yes, when EMI options are exercised, it generally does lead to dilution of existing shareholders' ownership stakes as such. But this will obviously depend on the percentage offered by way of the EMI. It might be only small percentages issued, which is less of a dilution, obviously. And then just going on to the normal mechanism for options to be realised. So essentially, if the options of exit only, they become exercisable immediately before an exit. So say, a few days before, the option holders would then become shareholders for a very short period, and the buyer would buy their shares as part of the overall deal. So hopefully that answers your question.
What I'm going to do in the meantime, while we're waiting for any questions, is just pop up our contact details here. You can see that there are QR codes here. You can connect to both Sophie and I on LinkedIn by just scanning those codes. So I'll leave that screen up for a few minutes just so anyone who wants to can scan those QR codes. And then in a moment, I think most of you have probably signed up, but I will also put up the QR code for the employment law mailer, which gets circulated weekly and just covers the latest weekly updates in terms of employment law. So I'll just leave this slide up for one more moment and then I'll swap over. But obviously, I think Sophie and I have done such a good job that no one has any questions. Other than that, I think I'll close it off. So that's the mailer code for anyone who wants it. I should have said actually as well that we will be circulating the slides and the link to the video recording after this session. So if you do want to share that with anyone who's not been able to attend today, then you're absolutely welcome to do so.